The courtroom was filled with the usual noise of murmuring people, rustling papers, and the occasional cough. It was a busy day, with many cases lined up for hearing. Among the crowd, a teenager stood nervously in front of the judge. His name was Jake, and he looked out of place in this formal setting. His hand shook slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. He had spent most of his life in and out of foster homes, but today was different. Today, he had something important to say. His eyes scanned the room, looking at the faces of the lawyers, the witnesses, and the judge herself. The judge, a middle-aged woman named Judge Collins, was known for being strict but fair. She had seen many young people like Jake, but something about him felt different. As the judge called the next case, the room grew quieter. Everyone was waiting for the proceedings to begin, but no one expected what happened next. Jake took a deep breath, gathered his courage, and then, without warning, he said something that made everyone stop in their tracks. "You're my mother," he blurted out, his voice echoing in the silence of the room. The word hung in the air like a bombshell, and for a moment, no one knew how to respond. Judge Collins blinked, confused, and looked at Jake with wide eyes. The room fell completely silent. The lawyers froze, and even the court reporter stopped typing. Everyone was staring at Jake, wondering if they had heard him right. The judge's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She had been a judge for over 20 years, and she had heard many things in her time. But this was something entirely unexpected. "Excuse me, young man," she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Jake didn't back down. He stood up straight, his eyes locked onto hers. "You're my mother," he repeated, his words clear and unwavering. The courtroom gasped. What was going on? Who was this teenager, and why was he saying such a thing? Judge Collins felt a rush of confusion flood her mind. She had been on the bench for a long time, but she had never heard anything like this before. She had no children of her own, and she certainly hadn't given birth to anyone who looked like Jake. She had no idea who this teenager was, but there was something in his eyes that made her pause. It was as if he truly believed what he was saying. The audience in the courtroom was now whispering among themselves, trying to figure out if they had heard the teenager correctly. Some people looked at Jake with sympathy, while others simply stared at him in disbelief. Was he mentally unstable? Or was there something more to this? Jake took a step closer to the judge, his voice growing stronger. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked. His words were calm, but there was a sense of urgency behind them. The judge looked at him, her mind racing. Could he be telling the truth? It seemed impossible, yet there was something about the way he spoke, the way he looked at her. Could it be that he knew something she didn't? Could he really be her son? The thought was too absurd to believe, but then again, stranger things had happened in the courtroom. The tension in the room was thick. The judge stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She turned to the lawyers, who were just as confused as she was. "I don't understand what this is about," she said, her voice firm. "Why would you say something like that?" Jake's expression softened for a moment, and then he spoke again, this time with a slight tremor in his voice. "I've been looking for you for a long time. I didn't know how to find you before, but now I finally have the chance to tell you. You're my mother. You gave me up when I was just a baby. I never knew who you were, but I always hoped I would find you." The room was completely still now. The judge's face turned pale, and she took a step back, feeling a chill run through her. She was struggling to make sense of what he was saying. How could this be? She had no memory of ever having a child. There had never been any mention of a child in her past. She had no family of her own. Yet as she looked at Jake, she couldn't help but feel a strange connection. Something in the pit of her stomach told her there was more to this than she could understand at that moment. Jake's eyes were filled with tears, but he didn't let them fall. He didn't want to seem weak in front of everyone. He had been through too much in his life to let his emotions control him now. He had spent years trying to piece together the truth, and now, in this courtroom, He felt like he was finally getting closer to it. But the judge, she didn't know anything. She didn't know what he had been through, and she certainly didn't know the pain he had carried with him all these years. Judge Collins was still speechless, her mind swirling with questions. What was happening? Could she really be the mother of this teenager standing before her? What had happened in her past that she didn't remember? And why had Jake chosen this moment, this courtroom, to reveal such a shocking truth? The silence in the room grew heavier, and all eyes were on the judge, waiting for her response. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The weight of the situation was too much. Would she be able to face the truth, no matter how unbelievable it was? The tension was unbearable. Judge Collins stood motionless, the shock of Jake's words still weighing heavily on her mind. She glanced around the courtroom, looking for some kind of explanation. The air felt thick, as if everyone in the room was holding their breath. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, a steady thump that seemed to echo in the silence. The teenager in front of her, this boy who looked so familiar yet so unfamiliar, was waiting for her response. His face was full of hope, but there was also a deep sadness in his eyes. He wasn't just saying these words to get attention or to make a scene. He was speaking from the heart, from a place of pain and longing that Judge Collins could feel, even if she didn't fully understand why. Jake stood there, not backing down, his gaze never leaving the judge's. His posture was tense, but his voice was calm. "I know this is hard to believe, but it's the truth," he said softly. "You don't remember me, but I remember you. I remember the day you left me at that orphanage. I remember everything about that moment. I remember the way you looked at me before you walked away, and I remember thinking you were going to come back. But you never did." His words were quiet, but they held an undeniable weight that seemed to pull at the judge's heartstrings. Judge Collins felt a knot tighten in her chest. She had never been married, never had children. She had dedicated her life to the law, to helping others in the courtroom, but she had never thought about having a family of her own. She had always felt that something was missing, but she had never been able to put her finger on it. Now, as she listened to Jake, the pieces of a forgotten past began to shift in her mind, though they remained just out of reach. Was it possible that her past had been so different from what she had believed? Could it be that she had a child, a son, that she didn't remember? The courtroom was still as a statue, every eye focused on the judge. She could feel the pressure mounting. The eyes of the lawyers, the witnesses, the crowd, all were waiting for her to react. The tension was unbearable. The judge cleared her throat, trying to steady herself. I don't know what to say," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I've never had a child. I don't remember any of this." Her words felt heavy, like they didn't match the emotions swirling inside her. Jake's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them away quickly. He could see the doubt in her eyes, the confusion. He knew how unbelievable it sounded, how impossible it seemed, but he couldn't stop himself. This was his only chance to finally get answers. He had spent years searching for his mother, and now he was standing before the person he believed was the key to everything. "I know this is hard for you to accept," he said quietly, "but I swear, everything I've told you is true. You're my mother, and I've been looking for you my whole life. Please, don't turn away from me now." Judge Collins could feel her mind racing. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay calm and composed in the courtroom, to think logically and rationally, but now she was lost in a sea of emotions. She felt like a stranger to herself. How could she not remember something so important? Was Jake just a confused boy, looking for answers in the wrong place? Or was there a deeper connection between them that she had buried long ago? The judge felt a wave of guilt wash over her. If this boy was truly her son, what had happened to him all these years? Why hadn't she known? And why hadn't she remembered him? What was she hiding from herself? These questions were swirling around her mind, pushing her to confront something that she wasn't ready to face. But the boy in front of her wasn't going to let her hide. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to stop until he got them. A part of Judge Collins wanted to dismiss the whole thing as a misunderstanding. She wanted to tell Jake that he had the wrong person, that she couldn't possibly be his mother. But another part of her, something deep inside her, was telling her that there was truth to his words. She couldn't explain it, but she could feel it. Maybe it was the way Jake looked at her, like he had spent his whole life searching for her. Or maybe it was the small details he had shared, the things he remembered that no stranger would know. The silence in the room grew longer, and the pressure was building. The judge finally looked away from Jake and glanced down at the papers in front of her. She needed a moment to collect her thoughts. The world around her seemed to fade away, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to question everything she had believed about her own life. What if this was true? What if she had a son? What if she had forgotten him? Jake's voice brought her back to the present. "Please," he whispered. "I just want to know the truth. I need to know who I am, who you are. I can't go on living like this, not knowing." His words were soft, but they hit her like a punch to the gut. Judge Collins felt a wave of compassion for the boy standing before her. She had never known his pain, his loneliness, but in that moment, she understood it. The courtroom was still waiting. Everyone was watching, waiting for the judge to say something, anything. Judge Collins took a deep breath and slowly turned back to Jake. The words she had been struggling to find finally came to her. "I don't know what's happening, Jake," she said softly. "But I promise you, I will find out. I will find the truth." Jake's face lit up with hope, but the judge could see the doubt still lingering in his eyes. She wasn't sure where this would lead or what the truth would look like, but one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. Jake's heart raced as he stood there, watching the judge's reaction. The way she had hesitated, the way her voice trembled, he could see that his words had shaken her to the core. He had hoped that she would immediately accept what he was saying, but he understood the confusion and disbelief in her eyes. After all, he hadn't expected her to recognize him at first. How could she? It had been years, and the woman who had once been part of his life had long since vanished from his memory. As Judge Collins stood there, lost in thought, Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of frustration mixed with fear. His whole life, he had wondered about his mother. He had spent countless hours in foster homes, feeling like an outsider, never knowing why he wasn't wanted, why he was left behind. The feeling of abandonment had shaped who he was: angry, confused, and above all, desperate for answers. He had tried everything to find her, searching every orphanage, every record, but it had always seemed like a dead end. Now, here she was, standing before him, yet she didn't even remember him. It was as though all the years of searching, all the pain, had led to nothing. "I don't understand," Judge Collins finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was shaky, as though she was still trying to process what was happening. "How could this be possible? I've never had a child. I don't even remember." She trailed off, her words failing her as she struggled to comprehend the situation. Jake could see the distress in her eyes, and it only made his own heart ache more. He had never expected this to be easy, but hearing her voice crack with uncertainty only made everything worse. "You didn't remember me, did you?" Jake whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "You didn't remember leaving me behind, but I remember. I remember every little thing. I was just a kid, but I remember the look in your eyes when you walked away." Judge Collins closed her eyes, as though the memories she had buried so deeply were starting to surface. She pressed her hand to her forehead, trying to push away the confusion. She wanted to say something, anything to deny Jake's claim, but the more she listened to him, the more she felt the weight of the truth bearing down on her. Could it be possible that she had forgotten her own son? The thought seemed insane. Yet, as she looked at Jake, his face, his eyes, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something familiar about him. The room was silent, the tension almost unbearable. People whispered among themselves, but the judge barely heard them. She couldn't tear her eyes away from Jake, who was standing there with all his pain and hope laid bare for everyone to see. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her. They were all waiting for her to respond, but she couldn't find the words. What was she supposed to say? How could she explain this? "Why didn't you come looking for me sooner?" Judge Collins finally managed to ask, her voice quiet and hesitant. It was the only question she could think to ask, but even as she said it, she felt guilty. How could she ask him that when she had no idea what had happened to him all these years? Jake lowered his head for a moment, taking a deep breath. He had been asked this question countless times before by social workers, by people who didn't understand his pain. But it never got easier to answer. "I tried," he said softly, his voice breaking. "I spent years trying to find you. I went from one foster home to another, but no one had any answers. Every time I asked about you, I was told you weren't around. I didn't even know your name. All I knew was that I needed to find you, to know who I really was." The judge's heart clenched at the raw honesty in his words. How had she not known? How had she not seen the consequences of her actions, the lives that were affected by her decisions? She had spent so many years focused on the law, on cases, on people she didn't know, that she had never once thought about the child she had left behind. She had buried that part of her past so deeply, convincing herself that it was for the best. But now, here was Jake, standing before her, and all her carefully constructed walls were crumbling. I don't know what to say," Judge Collins whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't remember anything. I don't know why I left you, or why I can't remember. But I promise you, Jake, I will find out. I will search for the truth." Jake's eyes softened as he listened to her. He had never imagined that the woman who had abandoned him would actually want to find the truth. He had always feared that his search would lead to nothing, that no one would care. But now, here she was, promising to help him find the answers he had been longing for. It wasn't enough to make the pain disappear, but it was a start. "I don't know if I can forgive you for what happened," Jake said quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But I'm willing to try. I just need to know the truth. I need to understand what happened." Judge Collins nodded slowly, her eyes filled with tears. She could see the pain in his eyes, the longing for answers that had shaped his entire life. She didn't have the answers now, but she knew one thing for certain. She would do everything in her power to help him find them. As the silence hung in the air, Judge Collins took a step forward, her gaze never leaving Jake. "We'll figure this out together," she said softly. "I promise you, we'll get to the bottom of this." For the first time in years, Jake felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel completely alone. The road ahead was uncertain, and the truth was still a mystery, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't searching in the dark. He had a glimpse of light, and that was enough to keep him going. As the courtroom began to settle, the weight of Jake's words continued to hang in the air. The judge's promise to find the truth felt like a small comfort to him, but it was a start. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was caught in some sort of twisted reality. Was it possible that this woman, this judge, was actually his mother? His heart, already battered by years of uncertainty, now pounded harder in his chest. What was he supposed to do with this new revelation? How could he trust her, or anyone, after all these years of abandonment? Judge Collins, still standing before him, seemed lost in thought. She hadn't moved, her eyes fixed on the ground as if trying to process the impossible weight of Jake's claim. Her hands trembled slightly. And for a moment, Jake could see the vulnerability in her, something that hadn't been there when she'd first walked into the courtroom. She had been in control, commanding the room, but now she seemed just as lost as he felt. "I need to speak to you, privately," she finally said, her voice soft but firm. "Jake, please, if you truly believe that I'm your mother, I need to understand everything. I need to hear everything from you. We can't do this in front of everyone. It's too much for one room." Jake nodded, his mind spinning. A quiet part of him hoped that talking alone might help him make sense of all this, But another part of him wondered if it was just another way for her to push him aside. He had learned to trust no one, least of all adults who always promised change, but never followed through. Yet something in her voice had shifted. There was something genuine there. He couldn't explain it, but he could feel it. The courtroom emptied, the buzz of conversation fading as people left to discuss what had just transpired. But Jake couldn't focus on that. He couldn't focus on anything except the judge, who led him into her chambers. The door shut softly behind them, and for a moment, there was a heavy silence. Judge Collins motioned for Jake to sit across from her at her desk. She took her seat, her eyes never leaving him. Her expression had softened, the rigid walls she had put up earlier beginning to crumble. It was as if, in that small room, the truth was starting to take shape, but she didn't know how to accept it yet. "Tell me everything, Jake," she finally said, her voice gentle. "I need to know what happened. How could I forget you? Why didn't I know about you all these years?" Jake hesitated. He had waited so long for this moment. Yet now that it was here, he felt a lump form in his throat. How could he explain all the hurt, all the years of confusion, in just a few sentences? Where did he even begin? "I don't know why you don't remember me," Jake began slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just a kid when you left me. I don't know if you had a choice or if something happened. But I do know that you were the last person I saw before everything changed. They told me you didn't want me, that you didn't care. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I believed for all these years. I thought I was abandoned, that I didn't matter to anyone." The judge closed her eyes, her face pained as she absorbed Jake's words. She wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him, but she knew that nothing she could say would undo the hurt he had felt. He had lived his whole life with that belief, that his mother had abandoned him, that he didn't matter. And now, here she was, sitting across from him, unable to answer any of his questions. "I never meant to hurt you, Jake," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I never meant to leave you behind. If only I could remember. I don't even know what happened to me. I don't know why I left. It's all so blurred." Jake's eyes softened at her words, but the pain in his chest remained. He had always been told that the past was in the past, that there was nothing to do but move on. But how could he? How could he move on from something that had shaped every part of his life? He didn't just want answers. He needed them. "You're saying you don't remember?" Jake asked, his voice rising slightly in disbelief. "You don't remember anything? How is that even possible? How could you just forget about me like I didn't matter?" Judge Collins' eyes filled with guilt, and she wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Jake, I'm not trying to make excuses," she said, her voice filled with regret. "I don't know how to explain this, but something happened to me. I blocked it out. Something from my past. It's like a fog, a haze I can't get through. But I know it's real. I know something happened to make me forget." Jake stared at her, his mind reeling. She was telling him that she didn't remember him at all. She was telling him that his entire life had been erased from her memory. But was she lying? He had heard of people blocking out painful memories, but could it be possible that she had truly forgotten about him? Could it be that everything he believed was a lie? Suddenly, a thought crossed Jake's mind, a horrifying thought. What if this was just some game to her? What if she had known exactly who he was and was playing along, pretending to be confused, pretending not to remember? The idea made him feel sick to his stomach. He had been through so much already. How much more could he take? Seeing the doubt in Jake's eyes, Judge Collins leaned forward. "I can't imagine what you're thinking right now, and I know I don't have any right to ask you to trust me. But I'm telling you the truth. I need to know what happened to you. I need to understand what happened to me, and I need to make it right." Jake took a deep breath. This was his chance to get the answers he had been searching for. He could feel the anger and frustration bubbling inside him, but he also knew this was the closest he would ever get to finding out the truth. The truth that had haunted him for so long was finally within reach. It was time to dig deeper, to uncover what had really happened. "Then let's find out," Jake said quietly, determination creeping into his voice. "Let's find out together. I don't care what it takes." The judge nodded, her eyes filled with resolve. "We will," she said. "We will find out, and we'll do it together." And just like that, something shifted in the air. A bond, fragile yet undeniable, had formed between them. A bond that neither of them could fully understand, but one that they both knew was real. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time, they had hope. Hope that the truth would finally come to light. As Jake and Judge Collins left the chamber, an unsettling silence surrounded them. The courtroom had emptied out, but the echoes of their conversation lingered in the air. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the path ahead was going to be far more complicated than he could imagine. He had always dreamed of finding answers, of having some form of closure to the questions that had tormented him for years. But now that the possibility of the truth was so close, he wasn't sure if he was ready to confront it. Judge Collins led him down the dimly lit hall, her steps steady, but her face clouded with uncertainty. She had promised to help him find the truth, but Jake could sense her doubt. She had always been in control, always the one making decisions, but now she seemed vulnerable in a way he hadn't expected. It made him question her more. Could she really be his mother? If she was, how could she have forgotten him? What kind of person forgets their own child? They reached a small office where Judge Collins instructed Jake to sit, while she gathered a stack of papers. She had already started contacting a private investigator, someone who specialized in uncovering forgotten pasts. The feeling of urgency in her voice earlier was something Jake hadn't missed. She was ready to search for the truth, just as he was. But what if the truth was something they couldn't handle? "Jake," Judge Collins began, looking over the papers on her desk. Her voice had lost some of its initial warmth, replaced by a colder, more professional tone. "I've made arrangements. We'll start with finding any records we can about your early years, your foster care placements, and if there were any legal actions related to your adoption. There has to be something that explains why you were left behind." Jake nodded, his mind spinning with the possibilities. He had always wondered if there had been something hidden from him, something no one wanted him to know. This was the moment he had been waiting for, when the truth could finally be uncovered. But at the same time, a fear gnawed at his insides. What if the truth wasn't what he wanted to hear? What if it shattered everything he had come to believe? "What if we find something that doesn't make sense?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if there's something I don't want to know?" Judge Collins looked up from the papers and met his eyes. Her expression was one of understanding, but also caution. "Jake, I'm not going to lie to you," she said softly. "I don't know what we're going to find, but I do know one thing. Whatever it is, we will face it together. I promise you that." Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Her words should have comforted him, but instead, they only seemed to deepen the weight of the situation. He wasn't just searching for answers about his mother. He was searching for answers about himself. The unknowns were overwhelming, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly lost. Over the next few days, Judge Collins remained in close contact with Jake, keeping him updated on her progress. She had hired a private investigator who had started digging into Jake's past, reaching out to orphanages, foster care agencies, and even the courts to try and piece together a timeline of his early years. But as the days turned into weeks, Jake's hope began to wane. The search was slow, and the more they uncovered, the more questions seemed to arise. The investigator found records of Jake's time in foster care, but none of them had answers about his biological mother. There were no mentions of her name, no clues about what had happened. Everything seemed to lead to a dead end. The investigator suggested they dig deeper into the court records, but Jake wasn't sure how much more he could take. Each day that passed without answers felt like another day of lost hope. One afternoon, when Jake was feeling particularly defeated, Judge Collins called him into her office. Her tone was serious, but there was an edge to it that made him sit up straighter. "Jake, "We've hit another dead end," she said. "I've gone through every legal record I can find, and I can't find anything about your mother or your adoption. It's like someone erased it from the system. But there's one last place we haven't looked yet, something that might hold the key to everything." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Where else can we look? Is there something I'm missing?" Judge Collins looked at him with a mixture of resolve and caution. "There's one person who might know something. Someone who might have been involved in your case back when you were a child. Someone who could have information we don't have. We need to talk to my former colleague. He's a retired attorney who worked on adoption cases. He's kept files on many of his cases over the years, and there's a chance your adoption might be in there." Jake nodded, feeling a spark of hope reignite inside him. "Let's do it. If anyone can help, it's him." The next morning, Judge Collins and Jake met with the retired attorney. He was an older man, his face lined with years of experience, but his eyes were sharp, as if nothing had passed him by. The moment Jake explained the situation, the attorney seemed to take an immediate interest. He wasn't sure what they would find, but he agreed to help them look through his archives. After hours of sifting through old files, the attorney pulled out a manila envelope and handed it to Jake. "This is it," he said simply. "The case you're looking for." Jake's heart raced as he opened the envelope. Inside, he found documents that detailed his adoption. Names, dates, and signatures that meant nothing to him at first glance. But as he looked closer, his hands trembling, something caught his eye. A familiar name. It wasn't Judge Collins' name, but it was a name he recognized from his childhood. Someone who had been involved in his life. Someone who might hold the final piece of the puzzle. "I don't understand," Jake said, his voice shaky. "Why didn't I know about this? Why wasn't I told about this before?" The attorney's eyes grew serious. "It's a complicated case, Jake. There are things in your adoption records that may not be what they seem. The people who were involved in your case may have had reasons for keeping things quiet. But now you have the key to finding out what really happened." Jake felt a mix of emotions, confusion, fear, but also a glimmer of hope. The pieces were starting to come together, and with them, the possibility that he might finally get the answers he had been searching for. But what would those answers be? And what would they mean for the relationship between him and the woman who had once been his mother? As they left the attorney's office, Jake looked at Judge Collins, his mind racing. "This is it, isn't it?" he asked softly. "We're getting closer to the truth." Judge Collins nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and concern. "Yes, Jake, we're closer than ever. But the truth isn't always easy to face. Are you ready for what we might find?" Jake didn't know if he was ready. But at this point, there was no turning back. The truth was out there, and he was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. Jake's thoughts swirled in a mix of anticipation and dread as he walked alongside Judge Collins back to her office. The file in his hands was like a weight he couldn't escape, pulling him further into the mystery he had longed to solve. But with each step, the reality of what he was about to uncover seemed more daunting than ever. Could he truly handle the truth? Could he forgive whatever he was about to learn? As they reached her office, Jake couldn't help but glance over at Judge Collins. She had been steadfast throughout this entire journey, but he could see the toll it had taken on her as well. There was a heaviness in her expression that hadn't been there before, as if she, too, was bracing for something she wasn't sure she could face. In all the years of her career, nothing had prepared her for this moment. She wasn't just a judge now. She was a mother, a woman who had abandoned her child, and a person desperate to make things right. Once inside, Judge Collins gestured for Jake to sit, and she poured them both a glass of water. Neither of them spoke at first, both lost in their thoughts. It felt like the calm before a storm. Jake opened the manila envelope again, spreading out the pages on the desk. His hand shook slightly as he scanned the documents. There were names, signatures, and legal jargon, but one line stood out to him. It was a name he had not expected to see. "I don't get it," Jake muttered, his voice almost a whisper. "Why is this name here?" Who is she? The name on the paper was Margaret Thompson. To Jake, it felt like a key to a door he'd never thought to open. The name didn't sound familiar at first, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized it had come up in whispers before. In foster homes, there were always strange mentions, people he didn't know, cases that seemed off. He remembered the name faintly from a few foster parents who had seemed a little too tight-lipped when he asked about his real mother. Judge Collins leaned over to take a look at the paper. Her face went pale when she saw the name. Margaret Thompson, she repeated softly. Her voice cracked. I never thought her name would come up. She was involved in your case, Jake. But her role, it was always a mystery. Jake's confusion deepened. What do you mean? Who is she? And why is she tied to my case? Judge Collins hesitated for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the name, as if searching her memory for some forgotten detail. Margaret Thompson was the social worker who handled your placement when you were first in foster care. She was part of the system that took you from me. But I don't know what happened to her. It's been years. I was told she retired. And after that, everything seemed to go quiet. Jake felt his stomach twist. A social worker? The person who had been responsible for his life in the system, and the person who might know why he had been abandoned, was someone who had vanished from the records without explanation. His pulse quickened as a new thought took hold of him. So, Margaret Thompson could be the one who knows the truth. About why I was abandoned, why you don't remember me. Judge Collins nodded slowly, her face hardening. Yes, she's the last link. If anyone knows what happened, it's her. But there's a problem. She disappeared without a trace. I've tried looking for her before, but it's like she vanished off the face of the earth. Jake slammed the papers down on the desk, frustration building up inside him. So, what do we do now? We've already searched everything we could. And now you're telling me the only person who might know something about my past is a ghost. There was silence in the room for a moment. Judge Collins's eyes were soft as she watched Jake's outburst, but she didn't try to calm him. She understood his anger. She had felt it herself. She too had been searching for answers for so long, and now it seemed as though they were running out of options. We can't give up now, Jake, she finally said, her voice firm, though there was a trace of doubt in it. I'll start a new search. We'll find Margaret Thompson. Even if she's disappeared, someone must know where she is. We'll track her down, no matter how long it takes. We owe it to you. Jake's frustration ebbed, replaced by a surge of determination. This woman, who had once been a stranger, was now promising to help him uncover the truth. He wanted to believe in her. He wanted to believe that the answers he had spent his whole life searching for were just within his reach. And yet doubt continued to eat away at him. What if this too was another dead end? What if the truth he uncovered was worse than what he had already believed? But what if Margaret Thompson doesn't want to be found? Jake asked, his voice quieter now. What if she's hiding something? What if I'm better off not knowing the truth? Judge Collins looked at him, her eyes steady. You deserve the truth, Jake. Whatever it is, you deserve to know. You've spent your whole life searching for it, and it's time to face whatever comes next. The truth will set you free, even if it's painful. The words hit Jake harder than he expected. Freedom, the truth. What did those things even mean when your past was built on lies and confusion? Could the truth really bring him peace? He wasn't sure, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't go on living in this state of uncertainty. It was tearing him apart. I'll do whatever it takes to find her, Jake said, his voice filled with resolve. If Margaret Thompson knows something, I need to know what it is. I don't care how long it takes. I don't care how hard it gets. I just need to understand what happened. I can't keep living like this. Judge Collins smiled slightly, her expression softer than before. Then we'll find her. Together. They spent the next few hours making plans. Judge Collins made calls to private investigators, legal contacts, and even old colleagues who might know where Margaret Thompson had gone. It wasn't going to be easy, But Jake's resolve was unwavering. For the first time in his life, he had someone by his side. Someone who truly wanted to help him find the answers. As Jake left the courthouse that evening, he felt a flicker of hope in his chest, mixed with the fear of what might be uncovered. He had spent so many years chasing shadows, but now, the truth seemed just within his reach. Whatever it was, he would face it head-on. And maybe, just maybe, he could finally find the peace he had been searching for all his life. The weeks that followed were some of the most intense of Jake's life. Every day felt like a battle as he and Judge Collins fought to track down Margaret Thompson. Despite the steady stream of phone calls, emails, and dead ends, Jake felt a growing sense of urgency. It was as if time itself was running out, and the answers he desperately needed were slipping further from his grasp. Judge Collins didn't relent. She worked tirelessly, reaching out to anyone who might have even the faintest clue about Margaret Thompson's whereabouts. It wasn't just the search that wore Jake down. It was the relentless pressure that came with the not knowing. What if Margaret was out there and refused to help? What if she had buried all the answers, hidden them where no one could find them? But then, one cold autumn morning, a breakthrough came. Jake was sitting in his small apartment, his mind clouded with frustration and exhaustion, when his phone rang. It was Judge Collins. Her voice, usually calm and composed, now carried a sense of urgency. "Jake, I found her. I found Margaret Thompson," she said, her voice a mix of relief and caution. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. "Where is she? What do we do now?" "Meet me at my office," Judge Collins replied. "We need to talk first. It's complicated." The drive to the courthouse felt like the longest of Jake's life. His mind raced with 1,000 questions. What would Margaret Thompson say? What would she reveal? He had prepared himself for anything, but deep down, he couldn't help but feel a strange, flickering hope that the truth would finally set him free. When he arrived at Judge Collins' office, she was waiting for him, her face as serious as he had ever seen it. She stood up as he entered, her eyes meeting his with a mix of sympathy and concern. "Jake, I know you've been through a lot already, and I know this isn't easy, but what Margaret told me, it's not what I expected. She's agreed to meet with us, but I need you to understand something." Jake took a deep breath, the weight of the moment sinking in. "What is it? What did she say?" Judge Collins hesitated. "Margaret said she didn't have any memory of you, Jake. Not in the way you think. She didn't forget you on purpose. But there's something else, something even bigger, that she's been hiding. Something that could change everything." Jake's stomach churned. His mind reeled, trying to process the words. "What do you mean? What's she hiding?" "Your adoption wasn't just an ordinary case," Judge Collins continued. "It was part of something bigger. A case involving multiple families, a secret network within the system. Margaret was involved in protecting a child from dangerous circumstances, your circumstances. She was forced to keep her distance from you to keep you safe." Jake was speechless. His mind couldn't wrap around the idea. "Wait, are you saying my adoption wasn't just an adoption? That someone else was trying to hurt me?" Judge Collins nodded slowly, her face grim. "Exactly. You were placed in foster care to keep you away from the people who might have been dangerous to you. Margaret didn't abandon you, Jake. She was trying to protect you. She didn't tell you because she couldn't. It was too risky." For a moment, Jake couldn't process it. His whole life, he had believed he had been abandoned by everyone, left to fend for himself. But now, it seemed that there was far more to the story than he had ever imagined. The door to Judge Collins' office opened, and in walked Margaret Thompson. She was older now, with gray streaking her once dark hair, but there was a familiar warmth in her eyes. She wasn't the stranger Jake had imagined, and yet there was an undeniable tension between them. This was the woman who had been part of his life in a way he never knew, the woman who had kept the truth from him all these years. Margaret's voice was shaky as she spoke. "Jake, I know you must have so many questions. I owe you an explanation, but it's hard. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted you to feel abandoned." Jake looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. The truth was finally here, and yet he didn't know if he was ready to hear it. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you make me believe all those years that I was just forgotten?" Margaret sighed deeply, her eyes filled with guilt. "Because if I had told you, Jake, the people who wanted to harm you would have found you. They would have found you, and they would have taken you away again. I couldn't risk that. I had to stay in the background to keep you safe. I had to make sure you were placed with people who would protect you." Jake felt a mixture of relief and anger. All these years, he had lived with the belief that no one cared about him, that he was abandoned without explanation. But now, the truth was far more complicated than he had imagined. So what now? Why is everything coming out now? Margaret shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Because the danger has passed. The people who were behind the threats, they're no longer a threat to you. I've been waiting for the right time to tell you the truth, but it's been hard. I didn't know how to face you after all these years." Jake was silent for a long time. The emotions swirling inside him were overwhelming. Anger, confusion, relief, but also something else. Understanding. He hadn't been abandoned because he was unwanted. He had been protected, even if it had meant hiding the truth from him. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet. "I don't know what to feel right now, but I think I understand. You did what you thought was best, but that doesn't make it easy. I'd spent my whole life wondering why, but now I know." Margaret nodded, tears slipping down her face. "I'm sorry, Jake. I'm so sorry." The room fell silent again, but this time, there was no tension. Jake didn't have all the answers, but he finally had some of the truth, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel completely alone. As he left the courthouse later that day, Jake felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the peace he had imagined, but it was peace nonetheless. He had found the truth, and while it wasn't easy to accept, it was the beginning of a new chapter in his life. He wasn't just a lost boy anymore. He was someone who had been protected, loved, and kept safe, even from the darkest truths. And that, in itself, was enough to start healing.